Hello and good afternoon. My name is Jack Lavin, President and CEO of the Chicagoland Chamber of Commerce. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Global Supply Chains in a Post-Pandemic World. The Chamber is committed to the ever-growing middle market, which is exactly why we're here today. The Chamber's mid-market program is dedicated to providing the programming, networking, and resources middle market companies across the region need to grow and prosper. We would not be able to do the work we do or host events like this without the generous support of our mid-market sponsors, BDO, BMO Harris Bank, and Aon. Thank you for your continued leadership, support, and investments in the Chamber. I also want to thank Amelia Salter, the Chamber's Director of Programs, for putting this program together today. She will also be the moderator of our panel today. An astounding 80% of organizations are reporting that their supply chains have been negatively impacted over the past year. These disruptions have caused significant shortages and increased costs in everything from electronics to lumber. We certainly knew there would be challenges coming out of the pandemic, and it's no surprise that the COVID-19 crisis triggered questions about the resiliency of our global supply chains in an increasingly interconnected world. While many parts of the world are easing pandemic restrictions, lingering effects continue to pose risks and challenges to companies and the global supply chain. But the outlook isn't all grim. For many businesses, the initial shock gave way to opportunity to build more resiliency and flexibility into their supply chains, from shifting to more local supply chains to making long overdue investments in technology and workforce training. Companies are taking steps to ensure they are prepared for the future. And as we hear more and more about labor shortages or resiliency of our current workforce and how it is impacting our supply chains, I want to remind all of you that the Chamber has an employer training program that will reimburse your company 50% of the training costs for you to upskill and reskill your current employees across a variety of areas. You can do this through our existing training partners, such as St. Augustine College, as well as existing trainers you may already be working with. This is a great way to train your workers for new opportunities as companies shift to buy locally for their supply chains or bring work in-house. If you are interested, we will include more information in the email you receive after this webinar, or you can reach out to Lily Scannell, our Manager of Talent Programs at the Chamber. We will hear about this and more from our panel. We are joined today by three experts who are sharing their perspective on historical impact and the growth opportunities we have, both now and long into the future. Fadi Shamon, Transportation Analyst and Managing Director, BMO Capital Markets. Chad Flieger, National Leader, Supply Chain Practice, BDO. And Craig Grosskart, Senior Vice President, Global Ocean Head, Seco Logistics. Thank you for joining the Chamber to share your perspectives and support our mid-market Chicago program. I'm very excited to hear from you and for the Q&A that we will have at the end of the program. Before we kick off today's panel, please allow me to introduce Steve Ferrara and ask him to say a few words. In addition to serving as BDO's Chief Operating Officer, Steve also serves on the Chamber's Executive Committee and Board of Directors. He is a former chair of the Chamber's board. Steve and BDO were instrumental in founding Mid-Market Chicago and helping the Chamber stand up our mid-market programming. Steve, thank you for your leadership and all you do for Chicago's business community. We are extremely grateful for your continued support of the Chicagoland Chamber of Commerce. I'll turn it over to you, Steve.
Thank you, Jack, and thank you, Jack, for all that you and the Chamber do and being the voice of business in Chicago and helping our business community thrive. I'd like to thank everyone joining us today and also thank our lineup of speakers for taking the time to share their insights. You'll hear from them in just a moment. As Jack mentioned, I am the Chief Operating Officer for BDO, and we are proud to be the founding and presenting sponsor of Mid-Market Chicago. When we partnered with the Chamber back in 2017 to first launch the program, we saw an opportunity to develop high-quality, targeted programming that supports and helps grow Chicagoland's middle market companies, who we all know are so vital to our regional economy. And along with our partners at BMO Harris and Aon, we continue to do just that. As you can see, we have no shortage of expertise for today's panel discussion, including hearing from BDO's own Chad Flieger, who is a national leader for our supply chain practice. But before we kick off the panel, it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker for today. Fadi Shimon is the Transportation Analyst and Managing Director for BMO Capital Markets. Fadi has been with BMO Capital Markets since 2010 and brings a wealth of knowledge in equity research in the transportation, aerospace, auto parts, and industrial sectors. He's going to share some data today regarding what he is seeing across trends in transportation. Fadi, I turn the floor over to you. Thanks so much. Everyone have a great day.
Hey, thank you, Stephen and Jack, for the introduction. I have a few slides that I will go over very quickly and leave plenty of time for Q&A. So maybe going to the next slide here. So we specialize in transportation. We cover a wide range of industries from railroad, logistics, trucking, air cargo companies like FedEx and UPS, and ultimately ocean transportation companies as well. What I'm going to do over the next few slides, just walk you through some of the supply and demand and pricing environments we're seeing in each of these modes of transportation, and what we think the outlook is for the next 6 to 12 months for each of those. So going to the next slide, freight transportation capacity shortages are not new. They're very frequent, particularly in the early stages of a cyclical recovery, as the supply typically takes a little bit of time to get realigned with the recovering demand. This cycle appears much more capacity constrained than we have seen in any cycle in the last 20, 30 years at least. And this is also across virtually every mode of transportation. We're seeing it in the ocean, in the air, and in the land modes as well. I think a global synchronized recovery post-pandemic, combined with low inventory levels, significant government stimulus, labor force shortages, rise in the online shopping, which really took us big step function change as a result of the pandemic, and there's a lot of other factors, have really made it difficult for the supply chain to quickly adjust to the demand recovery that we have seen during the pandemic low. So we're going to go through some of the, if you go to the next slide, to the each segment specifically. So if you look at this on the container shipping side, the ocean side, there is very little supply available today. So less than 1% of the global fleet is really idle. The fleet is actively deployed right now, and the issue is with the supply side of things, that it takes 3 to 4 years to really bring in supply into this market. The order book for new ships has more than doubled in the last 6 to 9 months. So supply is coming, but ultimately it takes time. In the meantime, the demand has been, obviously surging, and you can see on the chart on rates, we're up 270% on a year-over-year basis, up over 200%. All the trade lanes are really completely full, short of capacity at this point. We don't think really there's going to be a relief, especially going into the peak shipping season in the next 3 to 6 months, going into the holidays. We don't think there's going to be any relief. I think the earliest I'll probably start to see some relief is maybe going to be 2022. If anything, we think those rates could actually continue to be more challenging for shippers over the next 3 to 6 months. Moving on to the next slide. On the air freight side, The chart on the top left, if you're seeing it, like the last data point is interesting. Obviously, demand is up 9.4%, but capacity is down 10%. That's what we are living through right now. I think one of the biggest issues for the air freight market is that 60% of the capacity to move cargo in the air freight in the air market was fulfilled by the passenger aircraft fleet. And that passenger aircraft fleet is obviously still substantially grounded today, especially on long haul. So basically thinking about North America to Europe or North America to Asia, those markets are still significantly below pre-pandemic level. And so that capacity isn't there. Obviously, the cargo operators and some airlines have deployed additional capacity to mitigate that, but we're still substantially short of capacity in the air market. We have done a lot of work on this front. I think ultimately, in any case scenario we look at, it is unlikely that we see substantial relief in this market until 2023. Maybe late 2022, early 2023, we start to get some relief. Rates are, as you can see on that chart, have declined a little bit from the pandemic peak when the entire global aircraft fleet was grounded, but we're still, substantially higher than we were pre-pandemic. In some cases, 300%, 400% higher than we were pre-pandemic. And actually, more recently, I think as a result of what's going on in the ocean, freight is moving towards the air market as well. Those rates have actually inflected positive again. So they're beginning to rise again on markets like Asia to the US. We've seen a month-over-month increase of almost double-digit last month. So again, market is going to stay tight, improve gradually, but I think ultimately is going to stay pretty tight for at least through 2022. Now, moving on to the next slide, looking at the trucking market, the land market. Again, just by looking at the rates, you can tell that the market is very, very constrained. Rates are much higher than they were in 2018. And 2018 was a pretty substantial year because we had the pre-buy that happened as a result of the trade issues, the trade tariffs that were being put. So we had pretty strong demand back then, and the rates moved up pretty significantly. We're well above those rates right now, and we're still continuing to see week-on-week increases in those truck rates. And I think in the trucking market, the issues are potentially could be resolved in maybe 6 to 12 months period of time. I think, during the pandemic, the capacity to graduate more driver was constrained, obviously. I think the government stimulus money has also constrained how quickly the drivers come back to operate a truck fleet. And there's a number of other issues as well on a regulatory front that has really constrained the capacity for driver. Most companies that we talk to on the long haul trucking side will tell you in any given day, 5 to 10% of their fleet is idle because they can't find drivers. So I think, as we start to see some of these stimulus checks maybe roll off sometime in September, maybe into Q4, maybe that brings in some relief. We start to see some easing in that supply constraint. But I think, again, at the same time, Q4 tends to be the seasonally stronger months. So we think we're probably going to not see anything meaningful in terms of relief on that front, maybe until 2022. But this shouldn't be as bad as it is in the air or on the ocean. I think this could potentially be a little bit quicker to find some relief in this market. Moving on to the next slide, last mile parcel. So I think this was a market that had impact on the trucking market as well. You can see a step function change we saw in the e-commerce penetration as a result of the pandemic. So online shopping, e-commerce penetration. So I think that absorbed a lot of the driver capacity. Most drivers would rather drive during the day and go home at night. And I think the over the road long haul trucking has been impacted by that. So a lot of the capacity has been going into that market and leaving the long haul trucking market undersupplied. And I don't think this market is going to be normalizing at any point in time. I think this is probably going to continue to grow, maybe not at the same rate of 30, 40% that we saw in the past few months, but I think it probably is going to continue to see increased penetration in e-commerce going forward, and demand for capacity, driver capacity, van driver capacity, as we move forward. So next slide, I'll spend a little bit less time on this, but again, in the railroad industry where supply isn't really an issue, there's a lot of supply on the railroad side, but demand is also very, very strong. And if you look at the BMO Rail Demand Index, which is really an aggregator for all the leading demand indicators for rails, and you can see these blue bars on the right, they're as high or higher than they were in 2016 when we were coming out of the industrial downturn of 2014, 2015, 2016. So, and we're seeing demand as strong as it was coming out of the 2009 a financial crisis. So that index lead demand by about 6 months typically. So ultimately, again, we see demand continuing to be very, very strong here as we move into kind of the balance of this year and into 2022. There's been some shortages in the supply chain as well, automotive supply chain, chip shortages. So I think as some of these things are alleviated, that demand going to extend into 2020. But the railroad industry inability to really bring the supply to bear and help on the trucking side is that the last mile and the first mile operation for the rails, which are really trucking drayage capacity that will bring the cargo to a rail terminal, that is being constrained as well. So interestingly, like for the railroads, the month of May, we saw less domestic container than the month of April. And that's purely because ultimately we can't find that last mile truck capacity to connect the rail network to the consumer ultimately and to that shipper. So I think, the rail market is not as supply constrained specifically itself, but I think it is constrained by that last mile capacity on the trucking side, which is preventing it from providing the capacity that the overall market do. So overall, in conclusion, whether you look at rail or truck or ocean or air, the market is going to continue to be really tight for the next 6 to 12 months, and shippers have to find ways to, address their inventory strategy and demand strategy a little bit differently. I'm sure those will come in the Q&A, but I'll wrap it up here, Amelia, and pass it back to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Fadi. That was really helpful. And I think a perfect kind of level set as we kind of move into the panel. I think we're going to add kind of some, the ability to contextualize around this. So as we shift into our panel portion, I'd love to invite Chad and Craig up as well to join me on the virtual stage, if you will. Hi, everyone. My name is Amelia Salter. I'm the Director of Programs here at the Chamber. I'm going to be moderating today's discussion. I have the distinct honor and privilege of working with our partners and working with our speakers to make sure that today's discussion is hitting the points that are most relevant to you. So a quick reminder that we will have time for audience questions towards the end of today's program. And you can submit those at any time using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You can use the chat function too, if that's easier. Also, you guys can feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat as well. I know in a virtual environment, it's hard for us to kind of know who's in the audience. So please feel free to do that as well. And so Fadi, we kind of already were able to hear from you and have you introduce yourself. So I'd love to kind of kick it to our other two speakers as well to introduce themselves. And potentially as kind of part of that introduction, this is something we talked about on the prep call, which is just kind of, introducing yourself and your organization, but also one way you think global supply chains are going to look permanently different as a result of the pandemic. Chad, can I start with you?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for letting me be here today. Hi, everyone. Chad Flager. I lead our supply chain practice in advisory at BDO. I got about 17 years of consulting background with other firms as well as BDO, and got some industry experience as well in logistics, warehousing, transportation, and a little bit of customs and trade. So I'm a decent hybrid in terms of background. Um, I think a lot of supply chain people are scarred today, right? To a certain extent, the last year and a half has shown a lot in terms of really exposing issues that you may have already known. I think how supply chains will look differently, moving forward, coming out of the pandemic and the way the economical world has changed. I think people are going to have actionable plan B, C, and D, right? I think before you kind of had backup plans that kind of were far, a little bit fleshed out, but were not really actionable. And when you got kind of put to say, hey guys, we got a problem, we got to fix it now, people realized the plans they had weren't either actionable, weren't realistic, and couldn't turn them on as quick as they thought they could. So I think, yeah, actionable plans B, C, and D are going to be important. And I think, proactive risk management is becoming the most popular term that I'm talking about. So I think those are the two key areas.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. And Craig, can I kick it to you?
Right. Good afternoon. I'm Craig Wolsgaard, and I work for Seco Logistics, which is an Itasca-based 3PL. And my background, longtime ocean guy, been doing it for 30 years all over the world, lived and worked in 8 or 9 countries, ran ports, intermodal, NVOCC, carrier side. So just a long time ocean guy. The message I have, and it really supports everything that Fadi was saying. There's just no more room at the inn, and our supply chain is at capacity. Whether you look at it from a tonnage perspective, there is no additional tonnage in the market. The idle fleet is sub 1%. If you look at port capacity, especially in the East Coast, the West Coast, the inn is full. If you look at railroad capacity, especially as it relates to intermodal, I think Fadi had touched upon that. It is full. So as we transition from a just-in-time, which a lot of professors made a lot of money writing books, supply chain philosophy, we're going to a just-in-case supply chain philosophy. I think Chad had mentioned that. You've got to build inventories because you cannot count on the supply chain, the international supply chain, any longer. So I think warehousing and inventory is going to be, unfortunately, key, which will drive up costs.
Yeah, Craig, I think it's an interesting point. I think around the inventory piece, I think we're starting to have a lot of conversations around, well, we have our entire customer base, and some of them are big customers, kind of the 80-20 roll around revenue and customers. And what inventory do we need to build, right? What customers do we need to satisfy? Who are the customers that we maybe don't need to focus on, who either take so much of our time, aren't profitable, and really having a kind of cross-pollination conversation around inventory, both what do we need to have, what do we always make and sell versus what should we make and sell, what's right for the business, what's right for the strategy, and how do we combine both those worlds?
Yeah, I don't disagree with anything you or Fadi have said so far. I'm generally an upbeat guy, and I like to be positive, but I struggle in this market to be anything but pessimistic.
I think as we kind of go through today's discussion, it was really helpful to have Fadi start, right? Because we saw those kind of high level trends laid out, air, freight, trucking, ocean. And I know that's something you guys each kind of have a specialization in. And so for today's discussion, I think we're going to kind of narrow it down. But I do, on your note, Craig, want to at least be able to walk away with some kind of actionable kind of advice or guidance, and maybe we can find some optimism in it. We'll see. We'll work through it today. Fadi, I'd love to kind of kick it to you for that question, right? Because you're seeing all of this kind of at that high level data question of, do you have anything to add to kind of Greg and Chad's points about kind of how you expect supply chains, even once we get some of that relief you mentioned is coming, maybe as early as 2022, maybe a little bit longer, that our supply chains are going to look kind of permanently different 2022 and beyond?
Yes. I mean, I think there's very little that the shippers can do today to mitigate the immediate issues. Just supply isn't going to be there, and there is not a lot that they can do about that, I think. But as I think about this issue kind of over the medium, longer term, I think that, like Craig mentioned, there has to be a rethinking of, how much inventory is needed and how much you kind of manage the risk of that supply chain through inventory management. But I think also sourcing will be a factor. Where do you source from, and how do you kind of change the sourcing decision in order to de-risk the supply chain? But I think there's also going to be a recognition that some industries are always going to be higher cost going forward than they were in the last 5 to 10 years. And I think that's probably something that will apply in the ocean side of things. I don't think we're going to see necessarily the rates go back to where they were pre-pandemic levels. I think this industry is completely different from a consolidation perspective. And ultimately those rates will normalize from these kind of, high level that we're at today. But I think those costs will be higher than they were in the past. And that will impact the sourcing and where people decide to source from. And again, if you're a shipper that is doing online orders now, and your standard is 1 or 2 day delivery, that entire supply chain have to be thought differently, and you have to position that inventory, close to your consumer to be able to meet that 1 day or 2 day delivery time frame with the most optimal cost structure. So that's where I think warehousing and distribution is going to come from. So, I think there's going to be a lot of changes. I think people have also to, address the number of suppliers that they want to deal with. So do you want to deal with one ocean carrier or one trucking company, or maybe 4 or 5? And I think ultimately you have to try to diversify the supply chain from that end as well. So I think it's a complete rethink of the supply chain altogether, from where you source to who are the suppliers, and maybe now you're flying things from Asia to the States in order to make those short deliveries. But over time you may want to carry more inventory and use the ocean, which is a lot cheaper, or rail, or intermodal. So I think there's a lot for shippers to think through, and a lot of things that have changed structurally for the shippers on a go-forward basis.
I think a lot of that ties back to Fadi in terms of how can we spend the next 6 to 9 months knowing that the freight market's probably not going to change much. It might get worse, right? So now's the time, to me, and what I'm talking to clients about is, now's the time to take a step back and evaluate strategy. Really look at the pain points you had in the last 14 months, what weaknesses were exposed that you knew about, didn't know about, whether that's from a supplier perspective or from a physical footprint perspective. We're talking a lot around supply chain, the network modeling projects. Those are becoming much more popular, around simulation, around what ifs, where, if we want to, move our warehouses and our plants, where could we move? And that's more of even a conversation that goes above and beyond supply chain, right? That includes tax, that includes some of the geopolitical functions as well. So that's where I spend a fair amount of my time, is, around that area, helping clients start to think through that. Because at the end of the day, if things are going to be what they are for the next 9, 12 months, and let's say they never go back to pre-pandemic levels in terms of freight, and you can talk about all that stuff, but at the end of the day, the way to kind of accomplish some step changes is you got to change the physical flow of goods, right? And look at it more holistically than just supply chain.
Absolutely. And something that I'm kind of hearing across the board, and I know this came up during our prep call as well, that I wanted to dig in, is the kind of trend of mitigating risk by kind of moving your supply chains more localized or regionalized, because we know that while that reduces risk, often it's going to increase costs as well. I actually found a pretty recent study done in the past 6 months from Cape Gemini, which said almost 2/3 of organizations are now actively investing in localizing or regionalizing their supplier and manufacturing base to be closer to their customers. And so I just kind of wanted to throw that out to this group and see kind of maybe what you're hearing, both kind of the pros and the cons and how companies might be thinking through that. Craig, can I go to you with this one? I know you had some thoughts during our prep call.
Yeah, I have an old friend who's the CEO of a large Northern European port. And as a result of that role, he's on a lot of these EU commissions and EU bodies. And some of the things the EU's talking about to encourage nearshoring is to put a carbon tax on transportation. Now, obviously, that's going to be disproportionately painful to imports from China. The other thing that was really interesting is that they were going to put a fair trade or implement a fair trade tax. And that would be levied on imports from countries that the EU perceives as a bad player. Now, I don't think we have to spend a lot of time or consult the academic Fadi to realize what country that's targeted against. The other thing that came of that conversation was that this EU study said, in order to reduce their reliance on China, the EU I'm talking about, by 1%, the manufacturing capacity of Poland would have to grow 40%. So this is no easy task. And if you look at nearshoring here in the US for the US consumers, what are we really talking about? We're talking about Central America and Mexico. And those two origins have to come way up the quality scale. With the exception of maquiladoros, you don't have great quality yet. So they're going to have to start off with making furniture, knockdown furniture, and then cheap shoes, and then more expensive shoes, and then cheaper electronics, then more expensive electronics. So this is nothing that's going to happen in the next decade. And then when you talk about the infrastructure, you have to develop your capacity. From Mexico, you have to develop your border crossings. And we all know the politics of the border crossing at the moment. You have to develop port infrastructure in the Gulf and the Southeast. Now the good news, if there's anywhere in continental North America that has some excess capacity, port capacity, it's going to be in the Gulf and the Southeast. But then you got the rails, which are not really, with the exception of the KCS, the Kansas City Southern, are not real north-south. They're all east-west focused. So this is one of those things that I think Chad and Fadi would have some comments, but this is a decade or 2-decade process to really put a dent in anything coming from Asia.
Chad, can I get you? I know we talked about the data side of it, and I think a lot of the things that Craig just mentioned, kind of how you tie that together for a company to make that type of assessment.
Right. Yeah. It's not an undertaking you want to take lightly, right? Especially if you're talking about your manufacturing assets, right? You think about distribution, maybe a little bit easier than manufacturing, but I maybe think of it. I mean, it's a conversation that we've had, not just for this administration, but beyond, right? It's always been on the table. It's always been an intent to do that, right? So obviously it's a heightened situation now because of really the last year and a half, somewhat targeted to certain industries, but maybe Craig, I'm seeing it a bit more actionable, even though maybe it's not as mature as it should be. I'm seeing people taking the jump and the leap because they have to. Either they have to because of intellectual property concerns, right? It's not just the supply chain concerns with China. It's IP concerns. It's geopolitical instability, and a lot of times those are going to be the heavier, more strategic hitters than just the supply chain impacts. Obviously, the supply chain impacts, costs, service levels, et cetera, is where it really hits the fan in terms of the reality of it. But we're seeing people make the moves, wanted to actually model it, the scenarios, gather the cost data, go through and do the studies to do that. And keep in mind, like, there's only so much good areas out there, good partners out there to work with. And just because your company's considered doesn't mean there's not 100 other, 200, 300 other companies that want to do the same thing. So it's getting more competitive out there to actually find those good partners. To Craig's point around, not everybody is going to be as mature as they should be in that space to ensure quality. So to me, it's a matter of don't take the decision lightly, really get in, make a data-driven modeling decision, think about it beyond cost, service level, and really think about geopolitical as well, because that's probably the rising trend in the last, 4 or 5 years is that stuff's becoming way, way more important than it ever used to be. And you don't want to make a move prematurely into a market that's going to be the next China, whether the next target of the rest of the world for labor standards, for costs, for IP infringement. So that's kind of the key points on that one for me.
Adi, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I can chime in a little bit with some of the data that we have looked at, and we have published a number of reports on this, looking at where does the U.S. source its product, like imports to the U.S., where do they come from in the last 5 years, in the last 10 years? And I think we were already seeing this move towards Mexico. If you look, Mexico would be one of the top 5 fastest growing source of goods to the United States. You're seeing a shift out of China to Southeast Asia. I think the pandemic will accelerate that, but I agree with Craig that it's going to take a lot of time to really change that dependency on China. But I think some industries like machinery have made a significant move out of China to Mexico and to other markets like that. So I think we're going to continue to see that. And I think the pandemic was probably a catalyst to underpin a faster change in that market.
Absolutely. And something I want to make sure that we get to during today's discussion is a conversation about labor. So this came up, labor shortages. I think Forbes actually just published an article. It was titled like all of the shortages are because of labor shortages, right? And obviously, Fadi, you talked about this a little bit too, when you talked about kind of the movement from long haul truck drivers to delivering for more things like Amazon with the rise of kind of e-commerce. When we had our kind of prep call, we talked about some of the things that are contributing to this. And I know that this is something that the chamber is hearing from a lot of our members across the board is challenges hiring across almost every area, every sector, every company size. Buddy, maybe I could kick it back to you to just talk a little bit about the trucking side of things. I know we discussed in the prep call the need for kind of like schools and kind of what you're seeing there in terms of being able to meet those labor needs.
Yes. So I think, different part of the trucking market are behaving a little bit differently. So I think first, you had this big surge in e-commerce, which really required significant amount of hiring to meet that demand for last mile delivery. So that market absorbed really a lot of that capacity to meet the demand in that market. I think the other issue is that over the last 12 months, driver schools have been either shut down or operating at less than 100% capacity. So that lowered the amount of new certified driver entering the driver population. And I think there's also a number of driver population that is concerned about health, concerned about returning to work at this point, and that's also causing the supply side of things to be impacted. And I think also the long haul trucking, when it's in this post hour of service rules is making it really difficult for long haul trucking to find the driver. So in addition to the population is much smaller, the salaries or the compensation has to go up substantially to entice the demand to go back to that over the road trucking. So I think, over time, as the stimulus rolls off, as schools start to graduate enough drivers, as these congestion in the supply chain also release some more supply back into the market, things will start to stabilize. But I think this is probably more like 2022 timeframe, especially as we go into the next 3 to 6 months, when you expect demand to get stronger from a seasonal perspective. I think the solutions are going to be falling short of that still. But wages are coming up, and I think capacity will come back. I don't see structural issue here necessarily for the capacity to return to the market at some point, but I think it will take some time.
And Chet, I want to kick it to you because I know your background is in warehousing, and obviously someone needs to unload and load the trucks, and that's happening in warehousing. So can you talk a little bit about kind of what you're seeing there among your clients? How are they competing for talent? How are they making sure they have people?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, warehousing, just from a pick, packer, and shipper kind of role within the warehouse has always been what you call maybe a higher turnover role, right? It's just always lends itself to that type of a profile of resource. But I mean, you can take the Amazon effect, right? I think I've had clients that say when they're looking for new warehouses, where to go, they said, I don't want to be anywhere near an Amazon warehouse. I don't want to compete with them in terms of wages, in terms of the attractiveness of the brand, things like that. So it's really, really hard. At the end of the day, if you can't receive the goods into the warehouse, you can't pick, pack, or ship efficiently, then that's going to impact downstream, customer satisfaction and getting the product to market. So I think it's a problem. Companies are obviously throwing money at it. It's probably the easiest way to do that. That will only get you so far in terms of trying to retain people. People in the warehousing industry would jump for dollars per hour more. So it's not much. It doesn't do you much good to give them $3 more an hour more. They'll just take that and probably try and use that for leverage elsewhere. We're starting to have conversations around career paths. So trying to talk with resources around, well, what do you want to do beyond being the pick, packer, shipper in the warehouse? Do they want to build a career at the company? Trying to build that vision of evolving your career, bettering yourself, getting new skills, and graduating into that space. And I think that's a different way to look at it beyond just throwing dollars per hour at people. Other than that, I mean, just getting creative with incentive practices. Obviously, if you're a public company, stock, things like that, health benefits, getting as attractive as you can with the overall benefits package to help kind of take the pressure off the dollar per hour, price increases. But I think also within warehousing, it's interesting. I think we're all just more tech savvy than we used to be, right? So you'll find warehouses that are old school, that don't have technology, don't have devices. Obviously, if you want, that labor force to work in that new environment, that's also more attractive too. It's more exciting to go to work when you have devices and you have AGVs and those types of things. It creates more of an exciting, environment to work in. So I'm seeing some interest, and obviously that space is more driven by efficiencies and getting more, better at warehousing, but it also ties to the overall job experience of, hey, being the operator or being the tech guy in the warehouse, not the guy that just picks pallets all day.
Yeah. So
Chad, I just have a counterpoint to what you're saying. We have a large customer who has a 200-door facility in the Southeast, just across the border from Georgia and South Carolina. And a month ago, because of labor, so they went to a very rural part of the South, trying to get away from Amazon, trying to get away from more concentrated areas, hopefully being able to attract labor. 200-door facility, they were stripping 18 containers a day. That's it, because they couldn't get the labor. So you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't in this market. And all those things you said about attracting labor, I think that makes great sense, and they're going to have to do it.
Yep.
Alternatively, you invest in automation.
Yep.
Those are your only two ways. You go to a bigger center where there's a lot of labor, you compete against Amazon in the $19 or $20 an hour. You go to the rural community, you struggle to get labor. So I think the only solution is going to be automation. Yeah,
there's a balance there. I think with the automation piece, right? And then how do you sell it right internally to get the CapEx to actually go and spend money on that, whether that's more in the robotic space, the AGV space, or whether that's just through other avenues of technology, right? So it becomes a matter of, how do we how do we sell that, right? And I think that's, as a consultant, that's probably one of the biggest areas we're focusing on is the business case around that, because helping the people sell the idea to the budget owners to get that kind of funding. But yeah, I mean, the only thing in that example is like how much diligence and studies did that client do before they went out that far, right? Did they really do the analytics and the data to actually see the trends in that area, or they just kind of say, hey, we got to get out of here, got a good deal on the land, whatever that is, and did it? We really hold people accountable in terms of the analytics and doing the studies before you pull the trigger.
Well, to close that point, this is going to be a very easy sell to the board on automation in this particular example, because calendar year 2021, they've incurred $30 million of carrier detention.
Oh my,
So,
wow, that's
30 million.
Well,
Yeah, so-
that's an easy business case then. Yeah.
Yeah, that's an easy. Hell, I could sell that to a board.
Wow.
It's probably a lot higher when you add the loss of revenue as well, because they don't have the supply.
And goodwill. You're absolutely right, and losing space on shelves. Yeah, you're absolutely right, Fadi.
And I actually kind of want to build, and Craig, you took us right into kind of the next question, which is this: you're seeing all of this kind of pressure on supply chains. You're seeing a shortage of people being able to actually do the job. I think it leads to a really important question, which is, what is the role of automation? Should a company be making these kind of investments now? What does that kind of look like? Fadi, can I maybe kick it to you and see if you are seeing anything in the market, or how this kind of pressure might be driving that? Do you think it's pushing it quicker than it would had there not been this crisis that we're coming out of?
I mean, we've done a lot of work on automation in trucking industry, automation in the rail industry. And I think a lot of the technologies that are going to make a step function change are not going to be solving anybody's problem for the next couple of years. I think those solutions are more medium, longer term, but they start today. I think we're already seeing a couple of autonomous freight networks being tested, say between Nevada and Texas, where ultimately you can put freight on an autonomous truck after you dray it the first, 50 miles or 100 miles to a hub near the highway, and then you ultimately drive it autonomously for 1,000 mile, 1,500 miles, and then you dray it again on the other end. That could be substantial step change for the trucking industry, and ultimately really put an intermodal network where there isn't one today, because the railroads are tracks in the ground, that infrastructure that is known where it can go and where it can't go. But those networks could be an intermodal network that you can put up pretty much anywhere. But technology is still too early, I think, to kind of assume that it's going to provide that solution, in the next 3 to 5 years. I think beyond that time frame, I'd be surprised if those kind of technologies don't start to provide a meaningful change in that supply chain and that solution. And I think the productivity potential of these types of technology will be substantial enough to justify the capital spending that will have to go into making something like this happen, because it does have the potential to reduce the cost per mile by almost 40 to 50%. So that's one example. I think there's many other examples on the rail side as well. So I think technology pipeline is really strong, really promising, but the impact is probably still many years away.
Yeah.
I was going to say, I'm a big proponent of automation on the ports, right? I've run ports in Asia, and I've seen the ports in Europe and how automated they are. And the ports are a real choke point, right? With the labor situation, especially on the West Coast, you've got 8,700 odd hours in a year. The West Coast ports are operating about half of those hours. They don't operate nights. So if you invest all that money in capital in automation of the ports, you would eliminate a choke point. But to your point, Fadi, the railroads would have to invest an equal amount of money in automation. In other words, you're just, whistling in the wind. It doesn't do you any good unless that automation is from discharge to the door. It's a shame. It's going to take a lot.
Yeah. Craig, you pay a lot of attention to the ocean side of things, but with the contract for the labor on the ports coming up in July of next year, do you think automation will push forward this time around, or is there still a lot of opposition for it?
So I don't remember which year it was, 2006 or 2008, in the PMA, the Pacific Maritime Association, who is the group that negotiates their stevedores, their terminals, and their carriers against the ILWU, that it was agreed that automation, the PMA made concessions in rates and healthcare and pensions to allow for automation. And in the meantime, TRAPAC, LBCT, and a couple others have introduced in the West Coast significant automation. Pier 400, which is owned by Maersk, last year or the year before, tried to implement automated rubber tire gantry cranes. And the ILWU really took offense and really fought hard against that. It finally went to the city council, and the city council said, hey, a contract's a contract. You agreed, so you can do it. But and then Harold Daggett, who runs the ILA, which is the waterfront union on the East Coast and the Gulf. Think of Khrushchev banging his shoe at the lectern at the UN. We will not have automation in my lifetime. So the waterfront unions have really got to allow for that. But to your point, the ILWU negotiation next summer is going to be a real interesting one. The carriers who have the loudest voice these days within the PMA have always played the poor, pitiful me game. We're not making any money. We can't afford this. How could you? There's no more blood in this stone. How can you? There's nothing to give you. Now, with the carriers being so incredibly profitable, it's going to be a very interesting negotiation. And what I personally think is going to happen is the ILWU is going to drag their feet and then end up extending the contract 1 year. And all of a sudden, the carriers and the terminals are negotiating against the ILA and the ILWU in 1 year. That's what I personally think. But especially now, by the way, the ILWU has a new president, and this gentleman comes from a rather progressive local, second only to Oakland, and that's LA. And he's going to want to make his mark as the new president. And now the carriers are making money. It's going to be an interesting one.
Amelia, I think, we're talking about the supply chain issues, how they get solved in the short term. But I think this contract between the carrier and the longshoreman could be the next hurdle for the shippers going into next year, and the potential for work stoppages or strikes or things like that on the West Coast.
You've got a Democrat in the White House, and a Democrat is not going to be as quick to enact Taft-Hartley as a Republican. So this is their time. This is the ILWU's time. It's going to be a very interesting thing to watch.
By the way, one who gave an executive order last week to get more involved with transportation, right, in terms of fare, so that would probably come into play at some point, right, in this whole conversation. Granted, that's more on the labor side, that's more domestic focused, but the carriers' profitability are going to be involved in that. So we should probably expect to see some, I don't know, you tell me, but I would think you'd expect to see some dynamic there because of that.
Yeah, I don't know that the government has the teeth to do anything, right? It's a free market out there. And having been on a carrier side, there isn't collusion. there isn't. And the alliances don't foster collusion. So I think that's going to be a lot of hot air and no action.
Yeah.
You guys might have heard about the Chinese Ministry of Transport, which is really a ministry that has teeth, like most Chinese ministries. And they told the carriers to cease and desist with the rate increases. That has some teeth. I don't think the cooperation with the FMC and the Department of Justice have the ability legally to attack free enterprise.
Plus, they're mostly non-U.S. carriers. They're non-U.S. companies, right? So most of them,
with the exception of Matson, exclusively non-U.S. carriers.
Yeah.
So I don't see that coming. And let's face it, it's not the carrier's fault. This is my opinion only. When the audience is at home, look around your homes and look at all the new things that you've bought over the course of the last year. A new Peloton bike, a new credenza, a new desk, a new chair, a new this, a new that. That's what's filling all these ships.
That's what I told Amelia this week. I said, if you want to stop all this, consumers quit buying stuff, quit building houses where it's 40% more cost, quit buying all this stuff, and then we'll recalibrate the supply chain.
Yeah, it's interesting because as we come up on time, so I know we're coming up on, we have about 3 minutes left. I did want to get to like kind of quick lining of the 2 questions that we have been asked. And one of them does tag from your colleague, Jason Schultz, about kind of the increased sort of pressure and expectation that we're seeing from customers who are reliant on just-in-time supply chains in sectors like auto, home, all of that stuff. Kind of what are you seeing or what are you hearing from the clients you're working with in terms of the pressure they're getting from their customers as all these things are shifting?
Yeah, I think the main pressure we're talking about is, I tie it back to brand loyalty, right? Some of that was in the pandemic, right? If a consumer went to the shelf to buy something and it was what they normally buy wasn't there, they were either forced to make a decision out of necessity or just because they wanted that instant gratification to have something. So at the end of the day, supply chain's job is to get the product on the shelf, right? Get it to market so it can get on the shelf, someone can buy it, right? And whether that's in the B2B market, indirectly or directly through the B2C market, the pressure of the consumer and really thinking about demand differently in terms of, at the end of the day, supply chain's a cost. It's not a revenue driver for the most part. And how do we position that for success to actually protect revenues, not even grow revenues, but just protect it, right? Because that, once you have that loss of market share, it's really hard to get back. Tons of pressure there, and supply chains are getting pushed to be more stable and more predictable, and that's just not the reality of the world we live in right now. So it's hard to have that conversation. That's my 2 cents on that one.
And then another kind of question I wanted to get to, we are the Chicagoland Chamber of Commerce. We're based in Illinois. Illinois has a really robust manufacturing sector, strong transportation and logistics. To you guys, and I'll throw this out to the group, this is from our CEO. We talked a lot about sourcing from international sources. What opportunities are created for buying domestic supply chains? And I know we kind of talked about the pros and cons. Is there anything that you would say to our companies on the line to potentially folks who are involved in some of these groups based in Illinois, that we could position our, manufacturers and producers in Illinois to tap into this kind of trend of moving more local?
Yeah, I mean, my point of view there is, let's just start the model, right? Let's have the conversation. Let's do the what ifs. Let's play them out, not just from a cost perspective, but from an overall holistic perspective that includes tax. And I think we talked about this week too, was, this administration's tax policy is going to come out probably in the second half of the year. So I think a lot, doing the modeling now and then doing under the lens of tax reform, I think it's going to be an interesting conversation to have. So I think just start the model, play it out, use data, forecast, think about the demand. Don't use the demands that happened in the last 14 months as the exact, because that customer behavior is probably going to change, right? It might get more, it might get less. Just reevaluate that and model it and just push, just challenge the scenarios. You'll get to an answer.
Perfect. Great. Well, Fadi, Craig, Chad, I want to say thank you guys so much for your time today, for joining us and spending time with our members. This is a really valuable conversation, a really timely conversation. From what I heard, we might have to have a follow-up conversation to this in like what, 6 months, a year. Could be really interesting. Jack, can I kick it back to you for some closing remarks?
Sure. Yeah. And thank you, all of you. This was, it's very timely, interesting topic, and we greatly appreciate your perspectives. Thank you for being with us today. Fadi Shamon from BMO Capital Markets, Chad Flieger with BDO, Craig Grosskart of Seco Logistics. And of course, thank you to Amelia Salter, our Director of Programs, for moderating. Thank you again to our sponsors of the Mid-Market Chicago program, BDO, BMO Harris Bank, and Aon. It was a great topic today. A special thanks too to Steve Ferrara, the Chief Operating Officer of BDO, for joining us. And thank you again to all of you for joining us today for this webinar. And thank you for all your support of the Chicagoland Chamber of Commerce. And have a great rest of your day. Thank you.